Wow, so breaking news. We just found out that Mark Carney, the Prime Minister of Canada, will be giving a prime time address to the entire nation tonight at around 7 p.m. Now, the topic of this conversation is the upcoming budget that will be released by the Canadian government in just a couple of weeks. It seems like the government may be needing to do some framing here on just why this budget will look like it is and make sure that people aren't as concerned as perhaps they think they might be. The news just came out today, and this primetime address is not really something that's done too frequently. The last time an address that this magnitude was done was when Justin Trudeau talked to the country at the very beginning of the COVID pandemic. Now, this is important for every single Canadian because in this speech that the Prime Minister is giving, he'll be outlining what is going to be inside of this federal budget, which is the most important document that the government releases each year because it explains where the government will be spending its money and, in a large part, your money as taxpayers. How will this money be used to make the lives of Canadians better? Will it help the housing situation? Will it help the cost of living situation? Where will this money be going? We expect to hear a lot of these details tonight. In the rest of this video, we'll be going over what likely will be announced here because there are some hints in one of the major Canadian banks just put out a report that outlines their expectations. But I want to mention that I'll be live tonight to watch this. So if you want to join me to watch this live stream, we'll have additional response and reaction to what actually is here, additional analysis. So there'll be a link in the description so you can stay tuned and set your timers for that live stream tonight. Again, roughly around 7:30 p.m. Eastern. The last time we got an update from the government on the financial picture and where the money would be spent, well, that was around October of 2024. So it's been quite a while. Typically, we get an economic update in the fall and a budget in the winter, early spring in April, sometime around there, where we get the overall picture for the upcoming year. We didn't get that this year because the Carney government said, you know what, I've just taken on this role. We're in the middle of an election. It doesn't make sense to put out a budget right now. So they've delayed this. There were calls for it to be put out in the earlier months here in September, but now we know that this budget is coming out in early November. But again, tonight is when we're going to get all these major details. Now, in that last fiscal update, the projection was that this spending would be around $42.2 billion. That would be the deficit spending, the debt that the government would be going into to pay for expenses above and beyond the revenue that they collect from taxes and other revenue sources. Now, based on the new report that we're going to go over, this projection is somewhere around $75 billion with the potential for it to go all the way up to $100 billion of deficit spending. This is $100 billion of debt taken on above and beyond what our taxes can pay for. So that's a lot more spending than we expected. Not that it's necessarily a bad thing. We need to look at where this money is going to be spent and can we expect this to translate into better outcomes for Canadian people. Obviously, a $75 billion would be a lot more than 42.2, but $100 billion even more so. Where will this money be spent? This is the big question here. How will it help you? How could it potentially hurt you? Let's talk about all of this. This is the question that was being asked by Desjardins in this federal budget 2025 preview, which they're making no attempt to diminish. They're saying this is a budget like no other. They believe that the largest increase in spending is going to go towards defense spending. This is largely as a result of the new agreement that Canada has signed on to, saying that actually we will hit our NATO targets for military spending. If you don't already know this, as a member of NATO, this military alliance organization of the West, well, we're obligated to invest a certain percentage of our gross domestic product into the military, into defense spending. The idea is that the bigger countries will have to pay more in order to make this military alliance work, but that every individual country should be spending around the same percentage relative to their economic output for the year. Now, many people believe that Trump's more aggressive talking about this military organization and people needing to pay their fair share has prompted many of these countries to finally start taking this seriously. Whether you think that's good or not, we can talk about in just a moment. But as a result of that, we're seeing that this year we could be reaching just under $60 billion of higher defense spending in this year, with us reaching our future target in 2035 of 3.5% of GDP, which at that point Desjardins projects to be around $160 billion, or rather $150 billion each year. Now, we've already made the argument that some will make here that this is just a matter of us paying our fair share in defense spending as per these NATO targets. But there are critics to these types of policies as well. Many people will say that this stands to benefit the expansion of the military-industrial complex. This does mean the expansion of industry, hopefully in Canada, potentially new jobs created for some Canadians, more jobs in terms of mining and steel, and growth in the military-industrial base. But at the same time, Canada's historical military spending has been largely import-based. At least in the past, that's been the way it has been. Will the fruits of this increased massive spending produce economic benefits for Canadians and for Canada, or will it largely help out U.S. military contractors who largely may be turned to for much of this spending? I hope it's the former. Furthermore, critics will point to some of the skewed incentives that arise from these types of spending targets and commitments, with some people making claims that this spending makes us, and NATO at large, more likely to enter and remain in large-scale, long-term conflicts as a means of depleting in military resources to be bought all over again to sort of prop up this military economy. I don't know. What do you think about that? The next largest increase in terms of this spending will be related to the Building Canada Act. You might remember this from the election platform, where the Carney government promised to take on major nation-building projects. And as a result of that, well, we're going to be spending quite a lot more. The estimates are $7 billion over the next 4 years. Now, I've long been a proponent of allowing more development of infrastructure and our natural resources, as long as those things can be linked to expanding positive economic outcomes for more and more Canadians and a more and more diverse set, a larger set of those Canadians. And to be fair, while this was one of their major campaign promises, it was also one of the first things that was tackled by the Carney government, bringing in this legislation to allow them to start up some of these major nation-building projects. Though that doesn't mean that there hasn't been some criticism along the way. One of the main parts of this legislation was something that allowed them to, for the specific projects that they select, allows them to get around certain regulations that could make it slower for this infrastructure to be built out in the past. Now, they can jump by that as long as it's for a project that they select. Now, Carney has often talked about encouraging external investment, the government making investments so that other players will come in and invest their money, thinking that it's a better idea to do so. This Desjardins report talks about how that might not be going in the way that they would have expected. They say that metrics matter to investors. The criteria used to select which projects are part of this nation-building project, well, that remains vague and it lacks transparency that would help better understand why some projects are selected over others. Why would you choose to invest in Canada if you're not certain that the Canadian government will see things the same way as you do and support your major projects? One of the largest criticisms of this bill is that instead of actually slashing the regulations broadly so that anybody who wants to build is doing so on an even playing field and perhaps can do so more quickly, well, people are critical that that hasn't been done, and instead these regulations remain, but when the government selects a project, they're able to bypass these regulations. Some people think that more infrastructure and more industry would be developed if the playing field was even and more private businesses could expand. What do you think about that? The fact that there is such an expanded spending across the country here doesn't mean that there won't also be some savings in certain categories. One of the Carney government's major changes, you may look at this as a stroke of genius, or you might look at it as a kind of shady accounting trick, is to split up the operating expenses and the capital expenses of the government and to report those separately and to view them in different lights. If you're not following, it's actually very simple. The idea is that historically we've just presented all of the expenses that the government is spending on, presented those together. Now Carney and his government seem to be splitting these up into two categories. The first, the operational expenses. This is public sector salaries, the costs that go into operating the government on a day-to-day basis. They split that away from the capital expenditures, which would be viewed as money that's going towards investments, things that will build something in the future or could have a return on that money. At least that's the way that they're framing it. Now, some of that is good, right? I'm all for reducing the expenses of government, increasing increasing government efficiency, I think most people will be in favor of that, especially given this data that Desjardins has put out, showing the increase in the public sector, the full-time employees of the federal public service, saying that this was nearly 30% higher than in 2015 at last reading, which is more than double the pace of the increase in Canada's population. So Canada's population has increased, but the rate at which the federal public service has increased is double that population growth rate. Some people will say that this is a way that the government can justify its spending. If you always frame a lot of your spending as an investment, well then to the public this is going to sound better. Now the reality of whether or not these investments will pay off is just like any investment, it's uncertain. We've all heard for the past number of years, billions of dollars being invested into housing, billions of dollars going towards helping people in this increased cost of living environment. Do you see a real big increase in people's ability to deal with those crises? Most people will say that they haven't, at least relative to the amount of money that the government has spent on tackling these issues. I have personal concerns that the splitting of these two categories will mean that more of this government operational cost will instead be recategorized and shifted, potentially outsourced, so that they can put it into this capital expenditures category, meaning that, hey, it really should be categorized as operational spending, but perhaps this is moved to a different agency, wrapped into a different bureaucratic organization, and then counted over here in capital expenditures, so we're not as worried about it. And I'm not the only one that's thinking like that. The parliamentary budget officer, who's supposed to be a nonpartisan actor who reviews the government's financial decisions, well, they're worried about this too, saying that this capital category, rather than the operational category, that the capital category could be too broad. It could have too large of a scope. They say that based on our initial assessment, we find that the scope is overly expansive and exceeds international practice. The new definition of capital expenses includes everything from investment in tangible capital assets to tax incentives and grants to the private sector for capital investment. Will this always be seen as a positive investment for the country, subsidies that could be given to private companies? In some cases, sure, if it develops jobs and increases the Canadian economy, but we've seen examples in the past from both conservative and liberal governments where subsidies and credits are given to companies and it doesn't actually translate into adequate benefits for the actual Canadian citizens those actions are supposed to serve. Now, don't get me wrong, I'm not saying that it's certain that this type of spending won't help the Canadian economy and won't work to some extent. In fact, if we are going down this road of spending like this and it gets passed through the House of Commons and we're actually able to make this happen, well, I hope it works. I think everyone should hope that it works because if it doesn't, we could be in a tough situation. But I will highlight some of the concerns that I have about it, and I have been highlighting this on the channel over the past year or so, certainly over the past 6 months when it comes to the Carney government. Some concerns there, despite the chance that it could work out well. My primary worry is the moving of goalposts of fiscal anchors. Every time we've had a budget in the past, there's been some sort of fiscal anchor that's been attached to it. At times it's been saying, hey, you know what, we're not going to run a deficit at all. We're going to make sure the government only spends as much as the government earns in this year from tax revenue, right? That was a fiscal anchor. Now, we moved away from that and said, okay, we can run deficits as long as our deficits, the size of those deficits and our overall debt is not growing faster than the growth of our GDP. In other words, if we can grow our economy faster than we grow our debt, then we're on a sustainable fiscal path. This is a fiscal anchor. Now, with this increased spending and lower GDP growth projected in Canada, well, we're not going to be able to use that same fiscal anchor. And if we lose a fiscal anchor, then what's to stop the government from spending huge amounts? It doesn't tie us to anything solid that says, okay, this is the limit to which we're willing to go and we won't go past it. It seems like we're losing that limit here. My expectation is that there will be a new fiscal anchor that is framed as a fiscal anchor, and it is much related to this operations and capital new budgets, these two categories. If you can show as a government that your operational expenses are going down, even if you're spending huge amounts on capital expenditures, to which there might not be a whole bunch of transparency towards, if you can show that your operational expenses are decreasing, then you can credibly say, we as a government are becoming more efficient. Look, we have lower public services or public servants. We have lower spending as a government. That could be what they try to use as a new fiscal anchor. Whether or not that's a valid fiscal anchor is a story for another day, and I'm sure to be the subject of much debate. And again, I'll emphasize, I hope that this spending translates into positive outcomes for Canadians, increased quality of life for average Canadians. This is the metric that I want to see improved, as much as you can point to any one metric to show that. But again, I will talk about my concerns. What are the risks of taking on so much additional debt? The first question that you need to ask is, how does the government take on debt? Essentially, they issue what they call bonds. These are IOUs that investors will buy. The investors say, hey, Government of Canada, I will give you $100 for you to give me an IOU, which means that at the end of a year, maybe 2 years, maybe 5 years, you're going to give me my $100 back alongside a certain interest rate. That's how the government finances its deficits. But it only works as long as there is demand for those bonds, as long as you have enough bond buyers in the market to buy up that government debt. And that hasn't always been the case. Certainly you can point towards the pandemic when, well, the bond market dried up. The government all of a sudden needed hundreds of billions of dollars for things like the CERB and wage subsidies and other programs that propped up the economy at that point. But there weren't any buyers of these bonds. The answer was the central bank ended up printing a bunch of money to buy up these bonds, not printing physical dollars, but doing this on a computer system. Now, the result of that downstream, well, that largely impacted the cost of things for average Canadians. We saw a massive run up in inflation, not just in goods and services, but also in asset prices, further splitting the divide between the wealthy and the not wealthy in Canada, a class divide that I think was made worse by these types of actions. Does the spending that we're seeing announced tonight and today, does that increase our risk that something like this could happen again in the future? I personally think so, and I think it's been one of the more damaging things for the quality of life for average Canadians. Maybe I'm wrong on that, though. Let me know what you think. All this to say, I'm definitely anticipating tonight's live stream where we're going to watch this Carney announcement together. I'll cover all my live reactions there on the spot, as well as the reactions of some of the other political figures who I'm sure, no doubt, will comment on this this evening. Again, this is something that hasn't happened very frequently. I saw this tweet from Sean Speer that talked about all the times that this has happened in the past 20 years, and he said there's only 4 times it's happened this century. Trudeau in April 2020, Harper in December 2008, Martin in 2005, and Chrétien in 2001. This will only be the 5th time in the past 25 years that a prime minister has stood up on live television on prime time and addressed the country. Does that mean that this is pretty important? I think so. So I'll be watching. I hope you join me. There'll be a link in the description. Maybe I'll have a card here so you can click onto that live stream now and keep it maybe in another tab, or you can save it for later to make sure that you come back to join me here tonight. Again, going live around 7:30 p.m. Eastern. But with all that said, thanks so much for watching, everybody. I really hope this video helped you out at least a little bit, and I'll see you next time.